Hi everyone, I'm Kristen. I'm an instructor with SAS, and today I'm going to show you the wonders of proc transpose. Have you ever needed to restructure your data in order to get a certain graph or report? Well, if so, then you're in the right place. In this video, we are going to look at how to do both a wide to narrow and a narrow to wide transpose, first with one measure and then with two. So let's get started. We'll begin by introducing the data we are going to be using in this video. Now, I've recently started my own company selling and installing air conditioning units. We currently sell 3 different types of units at 3 different prices. We keep all of our AC sales data in a table that showcases the number of units sold and the total profits made for each quarter. The data spans from 2016 to 2020 and is sorted first by quarter, from most profitable quarter to least, then by year. As you can see, Q3, which takes place during the summer months, always has the highest amount of sales, with Q2 or spring following close behind, while Q4 and 1, which represent the fall and winter data respectively, don't do quite as well. Now, the data in its current form contains some information I won't be using. So I've gone ahead and removed everything related to the different unit types. I just want to focus on total units sold and profits for each quarter. In this video, our goal is going to be to create a series of graphs to display the data in different ways. However, it turns out that the tables may not always be coming to us in an ideal form. Sometimes the data we receive is in a wide structure, and other times it's in a narrow structure. If the data is not in the form we need it to be, then it's up to us to transform the table to fit our needs. Now, if you're not familiar with wide versus narrow data, don't worry, we've got you covered. Let's start by seeing what the data looks like in the wide or unstacked form. With the wide data, we see all of the information about each entity on a single row. This is ideal for visualizing the data in a listing report. The AC sales data uses each quarter as an entity, and all of the information for profits and units sold for each year represents a column in the table. On the flip side, we have the narrow data, also known as stacked, long, or tall data. In this form, the table contains multiple rows per entity. This is typically the preferred form for most SAS procedures. But as we'll see in this video, that is not always the case. Looking at AC sales in the narrow form, we can see that there are 5 rows per quarter, 1 for each year. Then we've got our 2 measures, profits and units sold, as our columns. In this video, we are going to be taking a look at 4 different scenarios that require the restructuring of our data. In the first example, we begin with a wide table that must be transposed to the narrow form. To start out, we are only going to be focusing on one of our measures, profits. In the second example, we'll do the opposite, transposing from a narrow to a wide table, once again with only the profits measure being used. Now, things get a little more complicated when we get to example 3. This time, we are performing our wide to narrow transpose with both measures, profits and units sold. And finally, in example 4, we will see the narrow to wide transpose once again using both measures. Now, before we jump into our first scenario, let's do a brief review of the proc transpose syntax. On the proc transpose statement, the data equals option references the input table to restructure, and the out equals option names the output table we want to create. If we need to group the data for the transpose, we include a by statement to list the column or columns to group on. However, you do need to make sure that your input data has been previously sorted on the grouping variables. You can use a proc sort step to do this. Now, as we saw in our intro to the examples, we are not always going to be using all of the data. The first two scenarios only focus on the profits measure. This means we will need to filter out the units sold, rows, or columns. To filter the rows as we read the data in, we can use a where statement. To select the columns to be transposed, we can use a var statement. Once SAS has transposed the columns listed, a new column will be created in the output table called underscore name underscore that holds the original column names as the data values. If you'd like to rename the underscore name underscore column, you can use the name equals option on the proc transpose statement to specify a more descriptive name. You'll also notice that the output table has columns named col1 through coln to hold the data we previously had as rows. To rename these columns, you can use the ID statement to use the ID columns values as the names for the new variables. You can also use a prefix using the prefix equals option on the proc transpose statement. Lastly, you may find that some of the column names in the output still don't look quite right. If that's the case, you can rename them with the rename equals dataset option on the output table, or if you'd like to remove a column altogether, you can use the drop equals dataset option. Now, both of these dataset options can also be used on the input table if necessary. Now, I know this is a lot of syntax to take in, so don't worry if it feels a bit overwhelming right now. We will see all of this in practice in the code when we get to the following examples. So let's get started with scenario number 1. Our goal in this scenario is to create a clustered bar chart to compare the total profits per quarter for the past 5 years. Now the data is coming to us in the wide form, and keep in mind we only need to worry about profits right now. We don't need to do anything with units sold just yet. So let's switch over to our SAS session and get to programming. Now we want to create the graph using the wide form of the data. Remember that for our wide data, we have one row per quarter and the profits and units sold for each year as our columns. Now I've gone ahead and written the proc-sgplot code that we will need to create the graph. Since the focus of this video is on proc transpose, I won't be going over the proc-sgplot syntax in detail. However, I have included links to the documentation in the description below if you're interested in learning more. So in our proc-sgplot step, you'll notice we've got one VBAR statement for the profits for each year, for a total of 5 VBAR statements. Now, to prevent the bars for each year from overlaying each other, we need to offset the bars to create a clustered chart. Now, this took quite a bit of guess and check on my end when writing this code. I had to play around with the bar widths and offset values to get the graph looking exactly how I wanted it. But once I run the code and take a look at the output, we can see that sure enough, the bar chart created using the wide data matches the desired bar chart. However, the code to create the graph was a bit tedious and time-consuming, so let's see if the narrow data is any easier. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a version of the data in the narrow form, so we are going to need to transpose the wide table to create one. But before we get started writing our proc transpose code, let's think about what information we need for each statement. Remember that we will be using up to 4 statements in the proc transpose step: by, where, var, and ID. The by statement lists the column to group on. We want to define groups as all of the data pertaining to a single entity, and for this data, our entities are our quarters. So quarter will be our by variable. The where statement is used for filtering the rows being read in. In this case, we want to bring in all 4 quarters, so we won't be needing a filter. The var statement tells SAS which columns we want to transpose. Since we are only focusing on profits right now, we will transpose all 5 of the profits variables, but none of the units sold variables. Lastly, the ID variable indicates which variables values we would like to use as the new column headers. Now, this is more useful in a narrow to wide transpose, so we won't be needing it in this scenario. Now let's head back over to our SAS session to write the proc transpose step. So I'm going to start with the basics for the step and add on additional statements and options as we go. So to start, we will have a proc transpose statement with the data equals option naming the input table, which is called AC sales wide. And then I want to add on the out equals option to name the output table I want to create. I'm going to call this example 1 AC sales narrow. And then, of course, I'm going to finish off this step with a run statement. So let's run this and see how the transpose looks with just these 2 options. Taking a look at my output data here, we can definitely see that the data has been restructured, but not in the way we wanted it. We wanted quarter to remain a column in the output, but instead have multiple rows for each quarter value. To do this, we need to add the by statement. So let's go back over to our editor and add the by statement for quarter, our grouping variable. Now I run this, but unfortunately, it looks like we're getting an error message related to the data not being sorted. In order to use the by statement here, we need to make sure the data is sorted on the by column. Quarter is currently sorted as 3, 2, 4, 1 based on profitability, but SAS doesn't recognize the data sorted that way. We need quarter to go from least to greatest. So let's go back over to our code and add in a proc sort step to sort the data by quarter. So a proc sort statement, the input table is going to be AC sales wide. And then I'm going to create the output table as AC sales wide sort. Then a by statement to sort by quarter and finish it off with a run statement. But don't forget, we also need to change the name of the table on the data equals option on the proc transpose statement. So I'm going to change this to AC sales wide sort. Now, when I run my code, I can see that I don't get any error messages and the data is starting to look a little more narrow. By default, proc transpose has transposed all numeric variables. But since we're not focusing on units sold right now, we want to tell SAS to only transpose the profits variables. And we can do this with a var statement. So going back over to our editor again, let's add the var statement. And we could list out all 5 columns here. Profits 2016, profits 2017, all the way through 2020. But that's a little tedious. So instead of listing out all 5 columns, I could instead use what's called a SAS variable list to reference the group of profits columns. Now we have 2 options we could use here. We could use a numbered range list that starts with profits 2016 hyphen to profits 2020, or we could instead use a name prefix list that starts with the word profits and finishes with a colon, indicating I want to transpose all of the columns that start with the word profits. Now, I prefer the name prefix list in this case because it saves me a little bit of typing. So I'm going to stick with that from now on. So let's go back and rerun our program. and take a look at the output. And we can see the table is now structured perfectly. All we have left to do is clean up the column headers. So let's start by using the name equals option to rename this underscore name underscore column. So going back over to my editor, the name equals option goes on the proc transpose statement. And I just set it equal to the new name I'd like to see instead. And I would like to name this year. I'll rerun my code, go back over to my output, and I can see the new column name. Lastly, I'd like to rename this col1 column. And to do that, I'll use the rename equals dataset option on the output table. So going back over to my code one last time, in parentheses directly after the output table, let's add that rename equals dataset option, renaming the col1 column to profits. Now I'll run my code again, take a look at my output, and I can now see that the data looks exactly the way I wanted it to. We've got our narrow table for profits. So now let's try using it to create our graph. Once again, I've already written out the code, but immediately we notice how much simpler this syntax looks. We only need one VBAR statement for the profits column, and then we can group by year to create the clusters. No guess and check to place the bars or determine their width. So let's run this program and go back to our output, and we can see that once again, we have a bar chart that looks exactly like the desired graph. However, this bar chart was created with much simpler proc sgplot code. So as you can see, the narrow form of the data does work better here. Now for our next scenario, we'd like to create an overlay bar chart to compare the total profits per quarter for 2019 and 2020. We'd like to see the 2019 bars in a lighter color on top of the 2020 bars to visualize our profits growth over the past year. The data we've received is currently in the narrow form. And once again, we are solely focusing on profits, holding off on units sold. So let's head back over to our SAS session and try out scenario number 2. So as a reminder, this is how our narrow data looks. We have 5 rows for each quarter, 1 per year. But remember, we only need the data from 2019 and 2020 this time. Switching over to our proc sgplot code, you'll see that since our data is in the narrow form, we only have one VBAR statement for profits, and we group by year to see the bars for 2019 and 2020. On the VBAR statement, there is an option called Group Display Equals that indicates how the bars should be displayed, either stacked or clustered. Unfortunately for us, there is no option for creating an overlay bar chart using our groups. So if we run this code and take a look at the results, we can see that the closest thing we can do here is create a clustered graph. So let's see if using the wide form of the data allows us to create the overlay. Once again, we are going to need to transpose our data, but this time we're going backwards. We're starting with the narrow table, and we need to get to the wide form. Our by variable will still be quarter. We want each group of quarter values to be a single row in the wide table. And remember, for this graph, we are only comparing the sales growth from the previous year. So we need the where filter to read in only the rows where year is 2019 or 2020. We also only care about the profits measure right now. So we add in a var statement with only profits listed as the transpose variable. Lastly, we want to include an ID statement to tell SAS how to use the values of the year column as our new column headers. By default, we would see columns titled col1 and col2,
but with an ID statement, we see 2019 and 2020 instead. So let's head back over to our SAS interface to write the step. Now, as we saw in the previous example, the data first needs to be sorted on the grouping column, quarter. So I've already written out a proc sort step to do this. Now again, we'll start with the basics of the proc transpose step, and then we'll add in statements and options as we go. So I'm going to start by writing out the proc transpose statement, and on the data equals option, name my input table AC sales narrow sort. Then I'm also going to add in the out equals option to name the output table to create, and I'll call this example 2 AC sales wide. And that's all I'm going to do for now. So let's add the run statement and run the program. Taking a look at our output, we can see that it looks like quarter is actually being used as a row. Instead, we'd like to see quarter as a column with one row per quarter value. So let's go back and add in our by statement to do this. Now on the by statement, our grouping variable is quarter. We rerun our program, check the output, and now we can see that we've got quarter back as a column. But we're still seeing multiple rows per quarter. One for year, one for profits, and one for units sold. Before we worry about that, let's add in the where statement to filter the data to only include years 2019 and 2020. Now we have two options for how we can write out this where statement. The first would be using the or operator, where year equals 2019 or year equals 2020. This works fine, but we do have to type out year equals 2 times. If you'd like to cut back on your typing a little bit, you can instead use the in to say year in 2019 or 2020. Now I'll stick with this syntax just because it does save me a little bit of time. I'll run my program. And now looking at the output, I only have 2 of those columns, one for 2019 and one for 2020. So let's get back to the issue that we discussed before. We want to get only 1 row for each quarter. Currently, we see 3 rows per quarter because SAS is transposing all of the numeric columns, year, profits, and units sold. We really only want profits being transposed here, so let's go back and add in a var statement. So on the var statement, the only variable being transposed is profits. I'll rerun the code, and now things are starting to look a little bit better. We've got 1 row for each quarter, but since we've only transposed profits, we've lost all of the year information. Now we don't want to add year to the var statement because then we'll have 2 rows for each quarter, one for profits and one for year. So instead, let's use the year values as our column headers to replace col 1 and col 2. We can use the ID statement for this. So I'll go back to my code, add in the ID statement using the year variable, rerun, and now I can see that I have 2019 and 2020 as my new column headers. Now at this point, things are starting to look pretty good, but there are a few more cosmetic changes I'd like to make. Notice that this underscore name underscore column just has the value of profits all the way down, the variable that was transposed. That looks a little repetitive to me, so I'd like to remove that column altogether. So let's use the drop equals dataset option on the output table to drop underscore name underscore. Rerun the code. check the output, and the column is gone. But now there's nothing here telling me what I'm looking at when it comes to the measures. I'd like something that indicates these are profits. So maybe I'll change my columns up here. Instead of just having 2019 and 2020, I'd like to have the prefix of the word profits out front. So going back over to my code, I'm going to add in the prefix equals option on the proc transpose statement to set a prefix of profits. I'll rerun my code one last time, take a look at the output, and it looks perfect. Now we are ready to attempt the graph again using our wide data. So let's head over to the proc-sgplot step. Now this time, we do need 2 vbar statements, one for each year, since we are dealing with the wide data. While this is a little bit more code, it will allow us to do the overlay. We've put the vbar statement for profits 2019 second, so it will be on top of the bars for 2020. We've also made the bar width a little bit smaller, so it doesn't look too much like a stacked bar chart. When I run my code and take a look at the graph, I can now see that I have the overlay bar chart comparing 2019 to 2020 that I wanted. Now we're ready to dive into the more complex scenarios. For example 3, we'll need to create a clustered bar chart to compare the average profits and average units sold per quarter for the past 5 years. We're starting out with a wide table, and this time we need to include both profits and the number of units sold. So let's get started. Now this example is going to look a little different because we want to calculate statistics. We want to find the average profits and units sold for each quarter. Since we're starting with a wide table, we need to calculate the statistics across the rows. So let's see if we can do this in our proc-sgplot step. I've already written most of the code. We just need to complete the vbar statements. Our category variable is quarter. Our first response variable is the average of all of our profits, and our second response variable is the average of all of our units sold. So let's see if we can write something that looks like this. On the response equals option, I'd like to use the mean function to get the average of all of my profits columns. Then I'll do something similar for the second vbar statement. I want to find the average of all of my units sold columns. Now I run the program, and unfortunately, it looks like we're getting some error messages. As it turns out, we cannot make calculations like this in the proc-sgplot step. We can only list a single variable on the response equals option. So we'd like to have a single variable with all of the profits data and a single variable for all of the units sold data. But unfortunately, we do not have that in the wide form of the table. So for display purposes, let's just go ahead and pick one of the columns for each. I'll go with the year 2020. Now I run my code, and I do get an output table, but it's definitely not what I wanted. We can see here that instead of getting the average over the 5 years, we are only displaying the year 2020. So we are going to need to restructure the data to create one column that holds all of the profits values and another column for all of the units sold. We can do this with another wide to narrow transpose. As always, our by variable is quarter. And since we want to include all 4 quarters in the output, we do not need to apply a where filter. The biggest difference with this example is that we're now transposing both of our measures, profits and units sold. And lastly, just like we saw with our other wide to narrow example, we will not be using an ID statement since there is no column here whose values we want to use as the new column headers. So let's flip back over to SAS and keep coding. Now we've already discussed what we'll need for this step, and it looks like the data has already been sorted. So let's go ahead and write our proc transpose step with the by and bar statements included. I'll start out with the proc transpose statement and the data equals option pointing to my input table, sales wide sort. Then I also want to include the out equals option to tell SAS the name of the table to create, and I'll call this example 3, AC sales narrow. Then I'll go ahead and add in the by statement, grouping on the quarter variable, and the var statement to transpose on all of my profits columns and all of my units sold columns. Now it turns out in this case, the var statement is actually optional. And that's because by default, SAS is going to transpose all other numeric columns. So if we're grouping on quarter, all of our other numeric columns are the profits and units sold columns. So by default, SAS would transpose them all. But I've already written out my var statement, and I like to be explicit in my code, so I'll leave that statement in there. Now, before I run this, I already know I'm going to have some issues with my column names. So let's start by using the name equals option to name the column that is going to hold the variables transposed. Now it looks like the variables being transposed, profits and units sold, have the measure first and the year second. So I'm going to call this column measure year. Then I'm also going to use the rename equals dataset option on the output table to rename that call1 column that I know is going to be created, holding all of my values as value. Now I'll run my program. And looking at the output, we do have a narrow table, but unfortunately, this will not work with our proc SGplot step. The two measures, profits and units sold, are stacked when we really need them to be side by side as separate columns. Now this can't be done in a single proc transpose step, so we're going to need to transpose profits and units sold in two separate steps and then combine the data back together. So let's start with transposing just profits. I've started a new program where I've copied and pasted the code we just wrote so that we can modify it a bit. We'll start by making changes to the var statement. Instead of transposing both profits and units sold, I only want to transpose profits. Then my output table, I'd like to specify this is only the profits data. So I'm going to add an underscore P on the end of that table name. Now for my underscore name underscore column, there's really only one measure here. So I can just change that output column name to year. Lastly, my call1, which contains my data values, the only data values I have here are the profits values. So I'd like to change this to profits. I'll run my code. And taking a look at my output, I do now have the narrow table for profits. But before I move on to units sold, let's think about how this is all going to play out. Since we're going to have two separate tables, we'll need to merge them together in a data step. To perform a merge in SAS, we must specify a column whose common values we can merge on. For this data, we could certainly merge on quarter, since both tables would have a quarter column with values of 1, 2, 3, and 4. But because this is narrow data, each value appears multiple times. we need to be able to uniquely identify each row. So let's try to merge on both quarter and year. But notice our year values have the word profits as a prefix. If the other table has units sold as its year prefixes, then we will not be able to correctly merge on year since the values won't match up. We need to somehow change the year values to remove the prefixes. Now, this is something we could certainly do in an additional data step, but instead of adding another step to this program, let's see if we can do it in the proc transpose. These values for the year column are the variable names coming from the wide table. So let's use the rename equals dataset option on the input table to rename the columns as they come in. So going back over to my editor, I'm going to add the rename equals dataset option at the end of AC sales wide sort to rename all of my profits columns. So from profits 2016 through profits 2020, I would like those to become year 2016 through year 2020. Then on my var statement, I also need to change the incoming column name to transpose. They're no longer called profits, they're called year. So now I rerun my program, take a look at my output, and now we are ready for the merge. So let's switch over to the next program to do the same thing for our units sold measure. But before I do, I'm actually going to come back to my editor and copy the code that I did for profits into the program for units sold and just change every reference of profits to units sold. So first, on the rename equals dataset option on the input table, my column names are coming in as units sold 2016 through units sold 2020. My output table name should have the underscore U at the end. My column I'm creating should be called units sold. And that's all I need to do. I run the program, check my output, and we're good to go. Now we're ready for our last step of merging the data back together. So to combine this data, we are going to be using a data step. But instead of a set statement to read the data in, we need a merge statement for both tables and a by statement to tell SAS which columns to merge on. So I'll start out with my data statement, and I am going to name this output table the same thing I tried to name it originally. Example 3, AC sales narrow. Then I've got a merge statement where I list both table names. Example 3, AC sales narrow underscore P. And then I have the same name, but at the end instead, I have that underscore U. Then I've got my by statement, which is the columns to merge on. First, I'd like to merge on quarter, then on year, and finally, a run statement. I run my code, take a look at the output, and now I've got the data that I was looking for. A different narrow form with a single column for each measure. So let's try again to create that graph. So going over to my proc SGplot code. Remember, we want to create a graph showing the averages of both measures for each quarter over the past 5 years. This time we have a single column for all of the profits data and a single column for all of the units sold data. We need 2 VBAR statements, one for each measure. But this time, we aren't trying to calculate the averages across the rows. We need to calculate the average down a column. ProcSGPlot can do this using the stat equals option on the VBAR statement. Here, we are finding the mean of profits for the first set of bars and then the mean of units sold for the second set of bars. When we run our code and take a look at the output, we can now see that we have the bar chart with the averages matching our desired graph. Finally, for our last scenario, we'd like to create an overlay bar chart to compare the total profits and units sold per quarter for 2019 and 2020. Our input data will be in the narrow form, and once again, we'll need to use both measures, profits and number of units sold. So let's head back over to our SAS session to get started with example number 4. Now this scenario actually builds off of scenario number 2. For the second example, we wanted to compare profits from 2019 to profits from 2020. This time, we're doing the same thing, but also including units sold as the orange bars on a second y-axis. In my current ProcSGPlot step, I have 2 VBAR statements, one for each measure. I'm grouping the data by year, and I want to see the bars clustered or side by side. When I run my code and look at my output, at first glance, it does look pretty good. I have an overlay clustered bar chart. But notice the bars for the new graph don't look the same as the bars on the desired graph. As it turns out, we're overlaying the wrong information. What we want to see is profits 2019 on top of profits 2020, and units sold 2019 on units sold 2020. But in the actual graph, it turns out we're seeing units sold 2019 on top of profits 2019, and units sold 2020 on top of profits 2020. So it looks like the data in its current form can't create the graph we want. So let's try restructuring to the narrow form to see if that works any better. Now, before we start writing any syntax, let's think again about what we are going to need to do for each statement. This example is going to require us to do another narrow to wide transpose. And once again, quarter will be on the by statement. But this time, we're only focusing on years 2019 and 2020, so we'll need to use a where statement to filter the input data. Now, unlike scenario number 2, where we were only looking at profits, this time we're also using units sold. So we'll need to transpose both measures on the var statement like we did with the last example. Lastly, because this is a narrow to wide transpose, we'd like to include the ID statement to use the year variable values as our column headers in the new table. We also want to add a prefix to show which measure each column holds. So now we're ready to write our proc transpose step. Now we'll go ahead and start by writing out the full step with all of our statements, since by now we have a better idea of what we're doing. So I'll start out, as always, with the proc transpose statement, the data equals option pointing to the input table, which is AC sales, narrow, sort. And then I'd like to include the out equals option to name my output table example for AC sales wide. Then a by statement with my grouping variable quarter, a where statement filtering on the years being read in 2019 and 2020, a var statement listing the columns to transpose, both profits and units sold. Again, in this case, the var statement is optional, but I'm going to include it anyways. Lastly, the ID statement saying we want to use the values of year as our new column headers. Now don't forget that we also want to add a prefix to those new column headers. So let's go back to our proc transpose statement and add in the prefix equals option to give them a prefix of the word year. I'd also like to go ahead and rename that underscore name underscore column that I know is going to be created. And because I'm doing both profits and units sold, I'd like to just go ahead and call that column measure. So I'll run my program, take a look at the output, and it looks like we don't have quite the wide table we're looking for. We still have 2 rows per quarter, 1 for each measure. Just like we saw in the last example, it looks like our transpose variables are being stacked instead of created as 2 separate columns. So once again, we'll need to use 2 transpose steps, 1 for each measure. Then we can bring them back together in another merge. So let's go back to the proc transpose step that we left off with and modify it a bit to only transpose the profits column. So on the var statement, I'll remove units sold. On the output table name, I'll add an underscore P for profits. I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of that name equals option because with only 1 measure, that column is pretty repetitive. Instead, I'll use the drop equals dataset option on the output table to drop underscore name underscore. Then I'd like to change my prefix to be profits. I'll run my code, check my output, and it looks great. So now we want to do the same thing for units sold. So let's copy and paste this code and bring it over into the next program and change every reference to profits to units sold instead. So first one is on the out equals option. Change that underscore P to an underscore U. Then on the prefix equals option, change profits to units sold. And then finally on the var statement, we are only transposing the units sold column. Let's run the code, check the output. Once again, everything looks good. So it looks like both tables are ready for the merge. So going over to our last program here, we want to write the data step to combine these 2 tables together. Now our merge will look very similar to the last one, but this time, since we're merging on wide tables, the grouping variable quarter is going to be unique. This means we only have to merge on quarter and we don't need to worry about a second by variable. So starting out with the data statement, I'm going to call this table example for AC sales wide. Then on the merge statement, I'll reference the first table, which is example for AC sales wide underscore P. And my second table has the same name, but instead of the underscore P at the end, we've got the underscore U. Followed by a by statement, merging on the quarter column. And finally, a run statement at the bottom. I'll run my code, check my results, and we've got our wide form. So let's try one more time to create that graph. Now looking at the code, you can probably tell that this is one of the most complicated proc SGplot steps we've seen so far. We have 4 vbar statements, 1 for each column besides quarter. However, to create an overlay clustered bar chart with 2 y-axes, the more complex code is necessary. When we run it and compare to the desired output, we see that it's a match. And if I were to hover over these bars, we'll see that we are in fact getting the 2019 profits over the 2020 profits and the 2019 units sold over the 2020 units sold. Now remember, the examples we saw in this video are just a few of many different times when you might need to transpose your data. And oftentimes there are multiple wide and narrow forms you can create from a single table.
So thanks everyone for watching. I hope you found this video helpful and you're a little more knowledgeable on proc transpose. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email or you can always leave a comment below.